Good evening. Welcome to the Hammer and to the UCLA Department of Art lecture series. I'm Hirsch Perlman, area head of sculpture in the UCLA Department of Art. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce James Welling to you. Here, here. Jim's work is too wonderfully varied to properly or adequately summarize in an intro, whatever that is. One parameter of Jim's work is fully abstract and calls itself that. Another parameter is pictures of trains, locomotives, and tracks, while still another parameter is pictures of supersaturated stripes of trippy color cutting across the leaves of agave plants. Much of my own faith and excitement in picture taking was restored when in the 80s a friend curated a show in Chicago called Sex, Death, and Jello. A lot of other artists represented the sex and death parts, but only one artist represented the Jello part. Jim's photos then of aluminum foil, drapes, pastry flakes, tile, and my favorite, Jello, were stunning. Great fun to look at, and they were silly. It was Jello, after all. Their proper title, gelatin, in Jim's lexicon. Since graduating from Cal Arts with an MFA in the mid-'70s, Jim has exhibited in, let's just say, countless exhibitions. His CV is indeed a small booklet. Some highlights, 1989, he was in the Forest of Signs show at the Museum of Contemporary Art here. He was in Documenta 9 in 1992. He was in the 2008 Whitney Biennial. He's had survey shows at the Kunsthal Bern, Switzerland, Wexner Center for the Visual Arts, the Baltimore Museum of Art in Baltimore, the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, as well as shows in Kunstverein, Kunstmuseums, and Kunsthalls throughout Europe. His work is in more than 30 museum collections across the world, including MoCA, LACMA, and the Hammer. In 2009, he received an award of excellence for the best show by the International Association of Art Critics in the United States for his 2008 exhibition at Regen Projects. Jim is also a generous and influential teacher and colleague. Since he moved to LA in 1995, he's been area head of photography at UCLA. He recently curated a beautiful exhibition called The City Proper at Margot Levin Gallery, which I think is up through only the rest of this week. And there is close to a yard lengths of solo exhibition catalogs and or monographs under the name James Welling. And following the lecture tonight, there will be a book signing for Jim's most recent book, Glass House. That'll be after the Q&A in the bookstore. So please join me in welcoming James Welling.
Thank you, Hirsch. I told him on the stairs, I'm glad I put those Jello pictures in the slide talk. I don't always include those, but something told me that I should probably put them in tonight. It's really great to be here at the Hammer. I'm usually on the other side, introducing people, so it's a little strange to be up here talking to you about my work. I was talking to a colleague today at a faculty meeting about the kind of terrors of talking in front of your hometown audience. When I do artist talks like this, it's usually with people I won't see tomorrow. So but it's great to be here, and it's great to be talking at the Hammer. I thought I would start by going way back to my prehistory as an artist, because in a way, recently I've come back to some of the things that I was doing when I was in high school. This is a watercolor I made when I was a junior. I think I was 17. And I was very taken by, I studied art from the time I was 14. I took art classes, did a lot of paintings, mostly watercolors. And I like to sort of emphasize that I've never studied photography, but I did do a lot of study of painting. So this is a watercolor I made in 1968. When Bob Gober curated the Birchfield show last year, I was super excited because Birchfield was one of my favorite artists as an adolescent. And this is the cover of a catalog that the company that my father worked for as a salesman produced of Birchfield's drawings in 1968. So this was like a big, very exciting to look at Birchfield's work when I was an adolescent, and it was great to see it 40 years later when Bob Gober did his kind of run-through of Birchfield. And here's another one of my watercolors from 1967, where I think we'll see later in the talk that I kind of come back to some of these same sort of atmospheric themes. And then this is the Birchfield poster I had in my bedroom called Ice Glare. Another artist who I was very influenced by and was very intrigued by when I was an adolescent was Andrew Wyeth. And when I tell people now, my students or anyone under the age of 50, if they've heard of Andrew Wyeth, there's like a blank expression on their faces. This was the cover of a catalog that I also had as a teenager that was just an amazing book. And as I look at it now, I realize that one of the things that draws me to photography is not only its relationship to the real world, but its relationship to printing. So I pored over this catalog, ruining my eyes looking at reproductions. But it was that interest in the printed page that now I see that we're able to kind of engage in making inkjet prints. And one of the great things about inkjet prints today is that it really mimics the kind of beauty of the printed page. Wyeth, a lot of people know his very tight kind of portraits, but Wyeth has a very kind of wild, abstract side. And this was the side that I was drawn to as a teenager, and which I've come back to looking at very recently. So this is a painting of two apples, and it's kind of amazing the way, this question of, get the laser pointer. These forms are just emerging out of these just incredible splashes of paint. And those were the things that I was kind of interested in when I was younger and still am. I studied art at Carnegie Mellon as an undergraduate, and I was fortunate enough to study with a second-generation abstract expressionist named Gandhi Brody, who liked to tell stories about how Jackson Pollock liked his work. One of the more memorable things, though, we did when I was Gandhi's student, we went to Mark Rothko's studio in the last year of his life. So that was really thrilling to be able to actually, me and my fellow students, kind of pulling Rothkos out of the rack, because Mark Rothko was too old to move them. He had heart problems. So we were moving these Rothkos around, and it was kind of a great experience. Gandhi Brody's work were these paintings on wood, extremely textured. He would work on them, and this is a painting called Fallen Tree, where a birch tree has fallen in the woods, and this is probably hundreds of coats of paint built up in this kind of obsessive surface. So this is the first photograph that I made when I was at Carnegie Mellon. Even though I didn't study photography, I was very interested in things like the Xerox machine and photographic images. So this is a photogram that I borrowed someone's darkroom and put a twig down on a piece of photographic paper. In 1971, I moved to California to go to CalArts. That's me on the left. And in Jack Goldstein's autobiography, someone talks about me wearing no shoes. And it's true, for the first year, I went around with no shoes and a blue knit cap. Coming to California was kind of a big shift from growing up on the East Coast. And the artists, though, that I encountered right away were people like Al Rupersberg and Bill Levitt, who, as Hirsch mentioned, I've curated a show at Margot Levin, and it was a great honor to be able to put Bill and Al and Gara Van Elk, three artists who I encountered like within the first week of moving to LA and going to see shows in this exhibition. I'm standing next to an artist named Frank Finley, who's a performance artist from the Bay Area, and Dave Trout, who played in the band The Weirdos. At CalArts, I studied with two important people, Wolfgang Sterkel, who's a video artist, and John Baldessari, of course, who all of you know and are very familiar with his work. The first quarter or semester that I was at CalArts, John was away, so I worked with Wolfgang Sterkel and became very interested in working in video. I the same way that students today use digital, cameras because it's so inexpensive. Video, it was pretty much free at CalArts. You got videotape without having to pay for it. So I made a lot of videos, and many of them were of the variety, a 1 hour tape would involve a 1 hour shot. So I'm going to show you a couple of my CalArts videos, but I've edited them down to spare you the incredible boredom of watching some of these tapes. But I've selected these two sections because they sort of predate some of the things that I later became interested in. So let's, if you could just roll the two videos, they're just about a minute each. This is a tape where I've pointed the camera against a white wall, and I'm moving my hand, which is you're seeing a silhouette of my wrist and hand up and down. What I liked was the contrast of the white and the black caused the edges of the frame to kind of bow out. So there's this weird stuff that's happening because of the video camera kind of can't handle the contrast levels. Also, every time I would play it, it would be different. And also there's some color that now is coming through this black and white tape. And the sound is also affected by the visual track. So when I started making video, I was very interested in the kind of these technical elements that I discovered working with the medium. And the second tape, if we could see that now, still have the same haircut. But there's some fluorescent lights here that I cover and then uncover. This was actually made in John Baldessari's class. So you can hear a discussion going on in the background. But this ghost imagery, I was kind of interested in how the video camera picked up this sort of ghost imagery. This is 1972. Okay. So those are just two snippets of some video that I worked on. I also became very interested in appropriated imagery. David Sally, who's a good friend of mine, and I were cutting pictures out of magazines and just wondering if just that picture out of the magazine could be a work. So this is a piece that I exhibited in my thesis exhibition, where I took from the LA Sunday Times magazine, I cut up these cigarette ads, and I made a triptych of images repeating this phrase. The piece is called "and should." So I worked for about 6 months with appropriated imagery. It didn't really stick in a way, but when I look back at this, I begin to see things like this obsession with the sun. A lot of my photographs have the sun in the picture. And also, there's some silhouettes up here that later come into some of my work. So this is a piece from 1974. I think the thing that I got from working with appropriated imagery was an appreciation for both cliches, but also a kind of uncanniness. So I became interested in sort of uncanny pictures. When I graduated from CalArts, I felt kind of lost. I wasn't making videos. I was cutting pictures out of magazines, making watercolors. And then in 1975, a friend of mine lent me a darkroom, and I made a couple of photograms of my hands. And this was a sort of first step toward going back to that twig photogram and beginning to think about what kind of work I could do. I was floundering, sort of thinking about different things, and then I encountered the work of Paul Strand, whose photographs came to LACMA in 1973, and and I subsequently saw a portfolio of his work in the library called the Mexico Portfolio. And this is one of the pictures. And I was very struck by the kind of almost rhetorical kind of heaviness of Strand's work. And I thought this was a big kind of contrast to the more kind of poppy conceptual art. Another event that sort of began to push me toward thinking about photography seriously was the new topographics exhibition that came to Otis Art Institute in 1975 when they were downtown by MacArthur Park. And this is a photograph by Stephen Shore, whose work I was very taken by because it kind of reminded me of Birchfield and Hopper, artists who I'd sort of thought I had to give up to be a contemporary artist. And in Stephen Shore, I began to see these amazing kind of images of, America in color. And a third influence in this, in 1975, 76, when I was struggling, trying to think about how to go forward as an artist, was an artist named Maria Nordman, who did a piece at the Newport Harbor Art Museum. And this is a terrible documentation, but this is an opening. It's a white void. It's a loading dock that she sheetrocked. And it's kind of a trapezoidal shape. And at certain times of the day, sunlight would fill this. And I went down and saw the show and was just very entranced by this, example of California light and space art, but it had volume and light and shadow. So in 1976, partly as a result of my thinking about Stephen Shore, I went out and bought a view camera and began to take pictures like this. I had to teach myself how to use a camera and process film, but I found that I really liked working with photography. I liked the kind of precision of using a view camera, the simplicity of it in a way, because you just took one picture at a time. You could go home and process that. And I also discovered contact printing, where I would print the picture the same size as the negative. So I would have these little tiny photographs. It's sort of a misrepresentation to see it this big because the actual prints are so small, sort of jewel-like. And I also began to take a lot of pictures at night because it was very sort of safe and easy to take a big camera out on a tripod and set it up at night. No one would see me under the dark cloth. Although I was stopped by the police once for photographing a jewelry store on Santa Monica Promenade. This body of work includes a number of portraits, and this is a picture of my very good friend at the time, Jack Goldstein. Jack and I worked in different restaurants. We were both cooks, and Jack would come out to LA from New York and make movies, but to make his films and photographs, I would get him jobs in different restaurants. So we were fry cooks together. And this is a 30-minute exposure, a 30-second exposure of Jack laying on his bed. You can see the cigarette, burning down in the enlargement. And this is a photograph of David Sally, who I was also very close to as a student and when he moved to New York. And although we subsequently sort of separated in our work, and he became a painter and I became a photographer, when I knew David, he was making films and performances. And this is another portrait of a friend of mine named Erica Beckman, who also went to Cal Arts and is a filmmaker, and she lives in Boston now. And this is sort of the a kind of good example of the type of photograph that really interested me when I was working these LA pictures. You have silhouettes, shadows, light coming out of the window, a kind of sense of mystery. And I began to think about this as a kind of picture that was almost like a diagram of photography, or somehow it was sort of para-photographic. I sort of stopped making portraits after I moved to New York. So this is pretty much the most extended group of portraits I ever made. As I worked on these pictures, I would go back and forth between the East Coast and the West Coast. I was living in Santa Monica. And when I would visit my parents and go to New York and visit my friends in New York, on one of my trips to Connecticut, I discovered a diary that my father's great-grandmother had written with her husband, Elizabeth and James Dixon. They wrote a diary of a trip to Europe in 1840. And I was very intrigued by this book. It was an incredible handwritten 3-volume account of their travels in Europe on their honeymoon, and it also had a lot of leaves and tickets and drawings stuck into it. And after coming from thinking a lot about conceptual art and art with language, I really wanted to photograph this diary. So I began to take pictures of the diary. And at the same time, on these trips back east, I would also take landscape photographs. And one of the things that I discovered in working on this project, Diary and Landscape series, was that the view camera was like a time machine. I could take photographs that looked like they were taken in 1840. The landscapes, the diaries, there's no kind of difference between a picture taken in 1840 and a picture taken now. And so that ambiguity of when the picture was taken, that uncanniness, was something that I was really fascinated by. And eventually I merged these two series of landscape and diary pictures together. So when I exhibited them, this is an installation shot from a show in 1990, I would hang them, on top of each other, a diary, a landscape, a diary, kind of alternating around the room. I also was very interested in still making contact prints in very small photographs. The idea that the photograph was almost a stand-in for the real thing by having a tiny print, same size as the handwriting, and the leaf. Of course, again, we're seeing it much enlarged. There are these tiny little jewel-like almost transcriptions, facsimiles, trompe-l'oeil images. And when I grouped them together, I sort of liked the things that happen with these 3 feathers and these little abstract shapes here. Although there's no fixed order to the diary landscapes, they're kind of, when I show them, I sort of mix them around and change them in terms of the pairings. In 1978, I decided I would leave California and move to New York. A lot of my friends had moved to New York. And so I moved to New York, and I got a rented part of a loft in Soho. And this is a photograph by Thomas Struth of Crosby Street and Spring Street in Soho, which was pretty much my neighborhood. And I love this picture because it's just like ankle-deep garbage on the streets. It doesn't look like that now. And when I moved to New York, I also began to sort of become aware of the idea that a lot of people thought of photography as street photography. And this is a photograph by Gary Winograd, who I've, of course, subsequently come to love his work. But when I was a young hothead, I was really kind of against the idea of street photography, that all photographs had to be of the everyday or what was going on outside. I was interested in, my history photographs or other sorts of things. So I began a project, again, wasn't a conscious project to make abstract photographs, but I began in 1980 to photograph crumpled up aluminum foil. And the reasons for doing this I had lots of reasons for trying to make these obscure looking pictures. But anyway, I was working in a restaurant, and one day I was looking at a piece of butter wrapped in aluminum foil, and I thought this would make a really interesting photograph. I don't have that picture tonight, but and we're getting to the Jell-O part. But so I was working in a restaurant, and I borrowed a large roll of aluminum foil, and began to crumple it up and take black and white photographs of the foil. This particular picture I've actually painted on the aluminum foil, so I painted black, so it looks like shadows, but it's actually black paint. So I was manipulating them, crumpling them, lighting them very simply, but still they were very kind of mannered in a way because I was also printing them very dark. And through my friendship with Jack Goldstein and Helene Weiner, who I'd met when she was curating out at Pomona in 1971, I began to show at Metro Pictures. So this is an installation view of my aluminum foil photographs at Metro Pictures. And it gives you a sense of how small they are. They're 4 by 5 inch prints in 11 by 14 inch frames, and I had a grid of 38 of them. And so I began to show at Metro Pictures, and the gallery that was also showing Cindy Sherman, Richard Prince, Sherry Levine, Troy Brontug, Louise Lawler, Laurie Simmons, and all of these artists I sort of knew about and began to discover more about their work. And we became this sort of group of artists who were looking at, a lot of us were looking at photography and trying to sort of do new things with photographs. Thinking about photography differently. And so the aluminum foil pictures, which I worked on for about a year and a half, very intensely, thinking about questions of slowly becoming aware of, the photograph is a representation. It's a referential thing. It always, we now call it indexical, but I thought of these photographs as doing something with the question of representation. A lot of people saw them as nature, so I realized that I don't have to go outside and photograph nature. I can kind of create nature in my studio. Forget who it was, which artist, maybe it was Cezanne, who said, I don't paint nature, I am nature. About this time, in the 1980-81, I became aware of Gerhard Richter's work, and Richter was beginning to show in New York, Richter's also been a kind of someone I've admired, been to his studio, looked at his work, thought about the questions of abstraction also through a painterly dialogue. And of course, abstraction in painting is nothing new. But the idea of abstract photographs, to me, seemed like something that was both almost an impossibility, because a photograph can never really be abstracted. It's always of something. As I worked on these pictures, I became interested in photographing drapes. Drapes have a lot of associations, so I associate them with the 19th century, sort of interiors and heavy fabric. And so I began a group of photographs after the aluminum foil pictures of drapery. And this is actually orange, really cheap drapery velvet, kind of like velour. And at a certain point in my restaurant career, which was very short actually, I was making a dish with phyllo dough and orzo. And I was looking at the phyllo dough and I was thinking this would make a really interesting photograph. And I went to the Grand Union and bought some packages of it, and then began a project where I actually photographed big sheets of phyllo dough, and then eventually I started crumbling it up. And these pictures, which are kind of a mystery to me because they're extremely evocative, they're abstract, they're kind of images of almost geological. There's a term called talus, when rocks fall down off of a side of a cliff, and these pictures have a kind of geological or fractal kind of quality, but they also, to me, seem kind of also emotional. And they also had kind of, these pictures had sort of interesting titles. This one's called The Island. The previous one was called Summation, and then this is called In Search Of, after the Leonard Nimoy show. But I just like the evocative, searching kind of imagery or name. A few years later, I went into the 20 by 24 inch Polaroid studio in New York and made some colored drapes with using a kind of brown fabric. And I was at this time photographing other 19th century subjects, so these kind of very rich, dark pictures also reminded me of kind of 19th century interiors. In order to kind of, at this point in the mid-'80s, I began to work on multiple projects, and I'm kind of skipping out of chronology now to show you some other pictures. The kind of critical response to these drapery pictures and my abstract pictures was that they were a critique of photography and that they were talking about the issues around both photographic representation and the idea of a kind of luxury, that some people were saying that these were the backgrounds for a watch ad, that the watch had been taken out of the picture, and so this is just the background. And I became interested in a kind of electronic background that I was beginning to see in print media and on television. It was called the gradation. So I made a series of photographs on and off for about 15 years called degradés. And I would go into a color darkroom and make 2 exposures on the piece of paper. This is just a purple exposure on the top and then a kind of yellowish exposure on the bottom. I was making some of these in the UCLA darkroom, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago, and I used a piece of cardboard to make these, and it says, I wrote in big letters, "Do not throw this out." And I remember Kathy Opie came up to me and said, "Jim, is this your cardboard?" And the materials for this are very simple. It's just a kind of piece of cardboard that I'm shading one half of the paper with and then changing the exposure. So I worked on these on and off, thinking about color. Also, people say they look like Rothko images, but to me they were always a kind of thinking about the idea of the background, a background where the figure has been removed. In 1984, I don't know how I got the idea to photograph Jell-O, but it certainly wasn't the restaurant world because I had stopped working in the restaurant. But I wanted something that was malleable, that I could photograph, that wasn't like dry like the feel dough. And I began to mix up very intense little vats of Jell-O that I would put black ink in, and then I would sculpt it with a steak knife and make these pictures. And I love the simplicity of the process, but the pictures are completely enigmatic. They look like coal or geological or tar. I guess these are my closest thing I'll get to sculpture. But this also causes me to think about the idea of tactility. A lot of my pictures are very tactile. I think I'm interested in kind of going beyond just the visual. These have a kind of intense tactility. In 1987, I began another group of works. I kind of had tired of making abstract pictures, and I began 3 different series of architecture, railroads, and lace factories. And all 3 of these are kind of almost primal types of images. These are buildings by H.H. Richardson that I photographed around the Northeast, which had incredibly intricate stone surfaces, and I became very interested in these sorts of massive, almost impenetrable facades. But they also, to me, represented the 19th century. And as I was photographing Richardson, he did a lot of train stations, and I, as Hirsch mentioned, I began to photograph railroads because I'd had a childhood interest in it, but also it's an installation view of the prints, which are now 20 by 24 inch silver prints. They also were landscapes that were laid down in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. So they're almost like land art from that period. And as the Beckers will tell you, they just make really good things to photograph. As I traveled around from mid-'80s till the early '90s, I began to photograph a lot of factories alongside the tracks. And this is a silver factory that made silver flatware in Meriden, Connecticut. And I became interested in these sort of industrial spaces near the railroad tracks. And I began to talk to a friend of mine, Philip Nelson, in Paris, and he set me up with a lace factory in France. So I was able to photograph a series of pictures called Calais Lace Factories of these incredible 19th century looms that were still weaving lace in the almost artisanal way. And they're also very high-tech looms in other parts of it was in the Noyon factory. And I did a show and a book of these photographs called Usine de Dentelle, or Calais Lace Factories. As I traveled around showing the work and making the lace photographs in another series in Wolfsburg, Germany on the Volkswagen factory, I began to work with the Pentax 6x7. And the Pentax is a camera that shoots 10 frames of film, but only 9 would fit on the contact sheet. So I would end up with these snipped off ends of the roll of film. And frequently they were of things that I didn't quite recognize. So I began to try to make a series of photographs of all of these unrecognizable or just disparate things. So the idea that could a series of photographs be made of disparate images. I was also spending a lot of time in Belgium and France, and I began to become friendly with Luc Tuymans, and this is a Luc Tuymans painting from 1993, when I began this body of work, which I eventually called Light Sources, because it seemed that almost all of the pictures had a light bulb or some other source of illumination in the picture. This is a photograph called Baffle, which is a kind of almost a model for the light sources idea of a picture that's a puzzle, and a baffle is also a grid over an elevator of light. This group of pictures is in the process of being printed by Steidl, so it'll be a book coming out hopefully in the near future. Light sources were the first photographs that I began to make digitally. In 1995, I moved to California to start teaching at UCLA, and when I moved here, I began to make a lot more photograms. Possibly it was the influence of Robert Heineken, who started the UCLA photography program. It was also a response to I was getting tired of the kind of lens-based photography that I began to see everywhere. And I sort of began to think about what was a photograph if you didn't use a lens system. What was a photograph if you just put things onto, these are made on film, where I put strips of paper on film and create these almost architectural, spatial configurations. So my interest in the photogram was an interest in looking at another side of photography, the side that is about the sensitized surface. This is a group of photographs that I made in 2000 called Mystery Photographs, where I was spending a lot of time walking by the Hudson River, so I wanted to make sort of the color of the Hudson River, but I also wanted to make these bars that reminded me of the tracer lines that you see on a TV set if you take a picture of it, or X-ray lines when you run your film through the X-ray machine accidentally. These are, again, things I made in the darkroom. And beginning in 2004, I began to make a large series of works that used screens placed in front of photographic paper. That also created a lot of moire patterns. It's hard to see on the slides, but the pictures are kind of composed of overlapping grids that create mores and kind of strange images. And that body of work I started in 2005. Also in 2005, I began a series of pictures using the same window screens, but I carved them, or cut them with scissors, and bent them and folded them into shapes, and placed them directly onto photographic paper. And the images that resulted they reminded me of torsos, bodies. So I began to call them torsos. And this is a scale picture. That's me and my mother at the Whitney Biennial. So the torsos began to sort of focused me on this idea of tactility, that a body is just a sense of touch. The torso is a kind of headless body, but it's all about the idea of touch and tactility. And I began to think that that was one of the themes, even though my work is kind of disparate, the idea of tactility sort of runs through it. As I began to work with color photographs, I began to think about this idea of what is color, how do we see it? And this is the first color photograph by James Clerk Maxwell, made in 1865. That's always kind of amazed me, because it's made up of these three channels. And, I began to think about what is a color photograph, or how do we see color, and as humans, we see color with red, green, and blue receptors in our eyes. And I began to think about whether it was possible to kind of replicate that in a photograph. And I began to sort of basically redo Maxwell's experiment using red, green, and blue filters. This is a picture of my mother's garden with these filters. It's a little hard to see, but in this picture you can see the filters aren't quite lining up. So there's a kind of halo. This picture I made in 97 or 98, but I really wanted to play with this idea of trichromicity. And so I began, finally figured out a way to kind of unlock this trichromatic channels in our eyes and in photography by working with multiple exposures in the same piece of film. So this is a photograph of succulents in my front yard during a Santa Ana condition where there's a lot of wind and shadows and bright sunlight. And I made 6 exposures with red, green, and blue, cyan, magenta, and yellow filters. So wherever there's a shadow moving and I put a different filter in front of the lens, you get a different color fringe. This is light coming through bamboo, like a 2-minute exposure where I'm exposing separate filters, and where there's no movement on the top, there are no color fringes. I wanted to go back to the darkroom and make some more photograms, so I began to work with a flower that also grows very commonly called plumbago. And I made some black and white negatives, and then instead of using trichromatic filters, I cut the filters up and put them up behind the image. So these are images that actually look a lot like watercolors or paintings, but they're photograms. 4 years ago, I was invited to photograph the Philip Johnson glass house, and I wanted to use that same technique of trichromicity, but once I got there was no movement. There was nothing moving. There was no wind. It was a totally calm day. So I began to take the arrangement of filters here and put them in front of the lens of my camera. So I began a group of photographs of the Philip Johnson house using these very intense colored filters. And I have a short video where you'll be able to see the movement of the filters. It's just an animation of about 200 stills. So if we could have the video. So as you can see, I'm moving different filters in front of the lens, and that's most of those shots were cameras on a tripod, and I'm just rotating the filters, making different exposures. Occasionally, I worked on the pictures. Well, actually, initially, I thought I would simply work in color and then add the sort of more arbitrary colors in the darkroom or in Photoshop. But that didn't work as well as actually working right in front of the glass house, moving these filters around, and taking the pictures right there live. Most of the pictures are done straight without any Photoshop manipulation, but this picture, which has a black and white bottom and a colored top, is put together in Photoshop. But in general, almost all of these are just actually done right on the spot. I thought of the glass house as a kind of lens that focuses. There are, I think, 12 buildings that Philip Johnson designed around the glass house over the 50 years he lived there. But the glass house is like this lens that focuses your attention on it. And there's a very strange pavilion that he built called the Lake Pavilion, which is a sort of shrunken three-quarter size. A friend of mine called it an unfinished mausoleum. That's in a lake, artificial lake. I'm not sure I have any other pictures of that, but I became fascinated with that structure. So this brings us up to the present. This is my last group of exhibitions of the Glass House, and the book published by Damiani, I'll be signing, and you can take a look at up in the bookstore. But I wanted to show you a few other projects that I'm working on. Last year, I collaborated with the poet Susan Howe on a book. She wrote poems, and I did photographs. So these are some of the photograms that I created for the Susan Howe book. These are photograms of acrylic paint on mylar. And Susan Howe has written a poem called Frolic Architecture based on the writings of Jonathan Edwards. So she encouraged me to go to the Beinecke Library at Yale and look at these Edwards papers. Edwards was a philosopher and preacher in the 1850s, and he wrote on amazing pieces of paper. Some of them were gigantic sheets of paper that he would fold up and turn into a kind of grid of boxes that he would then write in. So I folded the mylar, I made some grid images, pictures like this. And then, so the book is a letterpress with inkjet. It just came out, it's been published by New Directions in a trade paperback. And I have this particular spread. I can read to you the poem on the right. And I have my dummy, which I can bring up to the bookstore that you can look at. The material on the top is pretty much illegible because it's all cut up from different Edwards texts, Henry James, the Bible. I mean, I asked Susan how she would read this, and she said, I don't know, but she has read it. So this text down here, pursuit of a snowdrift, which the west wind was, and thither, at length, under a vast deal of, stranger into a corner where voices and enjoy herself, the snowbirds took flight, fled backwards, shaking her head, touch me, and roguishly, as I, through the deepest of the snow, stumbled and floundered down upon, gathering myself. So these very evocative fragments that she's assembled. And it was really thrilling to be able to work with her. And I wanted to show you just a few other things that I'm working on right now that I've not finished. And one is actually the work that I was making at the time of the Susan Howe project, a group of photograms made with water. And they're as yet dimensions unknown. They're made by immersing a piece of chromogenic type C paper into a tank of water and then pulling it up and exposing the paper to light. So you freeze all of these. It's actually the dyes that make the photograph are frozen and create a photograph. They're very gestural, kind of expressive pictures. And as I was making these, of course, I began to think about that Andrew Wyeth watercolor that I started with. And this September, I decided to do a project about Andrew Wyeth. So I went up to Cushing, Maine, and took a group of photographs in Maine, and then last month I went to Pennsylvania. And in Maine, actually, I was surprised to learn that's where Wyeth's buried, within sight of that house that he painted, Christina's World. So see, these are some of the pictures that I've come back with and I'm beginning to work on and process. Some of them are rooms that Wyeth painted in, others are images of scenes that he painted. And these will probably be large inkjet prints. And this is the last slide. It's a picture I took in December in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. So that's the end of my talk. I'll entertain questions.
If you have a question, please wait for the microphone.
Hi.
Oh, hello.
One thing, well, I think your work is very varied, and so I'm going to steer clear of general questions. But one thing that came up was when looking at the light sources and remembering Goethe's writing about the way that black and white affects our retina, and then the photograms that immediately followed that. I was just wondering if that was something that you were thinking about then, or if that came into your ideas later.
If you could just keep going with that.
Sure. Just especially like these intense contrasty pictures, like one where there are all these spheres of white sitting on black, and Goethe's experiments where he would have
Right.
discs.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
You see after images when you look at black and white images, intense black and white contrasts, which is sort of what happened in that early video with my hand. That it's inevitable, it's a video projector, but you also see flashes of color. The strange thing about working with all of these color experiments is I begin to see color that way, and I begin to see the world based on the photographs that I'm taking. So when I was working on that very early picture of the garden and the tricolor picture of the inlet with the water, I would begin to see almost color fringes, or when I was making the glass house pictures, no matter how intense and brightly colored the filters I was using, I would then see that color when I would come home in a magazine or actually out the window. Or so I'm not sure if this answers your question, but the experience of working with, I think this is true of all visual artists who work intensely on something, then they begin to see that thing that they're working on repeated in the world around them. I mean, now I see brown because I'm working on Andrew Wyeth. In Wyeth land, all I see is like brown-colored things. Wait for the mic. Then I don't have to repeat the question.
Do you maintain a private painting practice still?
I maintain a lot of practices in private. I mean, yes, I do. But I also, I also write and do other things. But, I think I feel that, I didn't expect to become so attracted to photography, when I started out. But I feel that even though I like to think about painting, I think my intelligence in the last 30 years has become photographic. So yes, I do paint a little bit, but it's just to make studies, to think about things that I can't or haven't yet photographed.
Hi, I'm actually pretty fascinated by your attention to Wyeth. I didn't realize he did things that were quasi-abstract. And that painting, you kind of pointed out I guess there were apples kind of emerging from the whatever it was, the kind of Klein-esque kind of whatever. So I'm wondering do you get caught up in the what used to probably be very ideological discussions of what it meant to be an abstract painter, and then to actually have something that's actually representational within an abstract composition? It seems like some people would actually think that was dangerous territory. And I'm wondering if this is something that you get, do you get caught up in this? And do you also, I felt like there was a couple of photographs, like one of the final ones, which was of Wyeth's grave, his grave. You could easily look at that photograph as actually quite abstract. Like you could look at the photograph as merely being an issue of shapes on a flat plane, but then of course there's going to be spatial dimensions, and it's it's unsure to me what are you giving yourself over to, the kind of flat plane idea to the the Renaissance space idea? Do you get caught up in those kinds of issues? I guess is what I'm asking, or do people press you on those issues?
I think I'm more interested in human perception, visual perception, and I think the questions, of course, I'm extremely interested in issues around Renaissance perspective, what a picture is, the picture plane, windows, the history of the idea of the picture. I'm equally interested, not in a scientific sense. I don't really understand how we perceive, but I'm interested in what seeing before understanding consists of before you put it together visually. I think there have been all kinds of kind of pseudoscience books about. I think there's one book called Was Proust a Neuroscientist or something, and it talks about how Cézanne understood atomically how we see or how the neurons work in the brain. I mean, I'm not interested in that level, but I'm interested in lived perception, and I think seeing and using our eyes and vision is much more complicated than we understand it. I mean, Walter Benjamin, who wrote a couple of essays about taking hashish, talks about the immense number of images that appear to us in our brains, but we just can't deal with them. Not on hashish, but just in everyday life, and that our brains kind of shut down and we can't process all of the imagery that we're seeing. So there's this way that I'm, as I work in different quasi-abstract photographs, I begin to see them as actual, not abstract at all, but things that I actually see. So there's this interesting, dialogue. I think most artists experience that, where you look at a certain phenomena of visual making, and then you begin to see it everywhere. I don't think I answered your question, but I tried.
Hi, I was interested in your collaboration with the poet, and I was inquiring after the process of that collaboration, because you're not an independent photographer, and you do want it to tie in somehow with her poetry to make it a composite collection. So how did that come about? I understand that you looked at the writings she was inspired by, and you said you looked at the big folded up papers with the grids, and that's how. But how do you navigate that sort of collaboration?
Well,
When you have your own ideas and hers.
Susan's daughter was a painter I know, R.H. Quaitman, and so she told Susan that I might be a good person for her to work with. So I knew Susan's work a little bit, so I liked her poetry and her prose. But initially, she gave me the poem to read. It's a 60-page poem, and I came up with a couple of things that both of us agreed were not satisfactory. And so then a couple of months passed, and I just thought about the experience of going to the library and seeing these manuscripts and her poem, and just, I let it, didn't think about it, and then began to work on these water pictures, and made a series of photograms for Susan, and she really, it was just a very fortuitous kind of coming together. It was a great collaboration because I was extremely happy with what the pictures that I produced for her. I gave her about 40 photographs, and she sequenced them with her poems. So it was just a really great, it wasn't effortless, but it was a really beautiful collaboration.
I got kind of two questions. Maybe you could pick which one you find more interesting. The first is, you mentioned the uncanny, and there does seem to be a real uncanniness throughout all your pieces. No matter how diverse they get, there seems to be that distancing that happens. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the uncanny and what that means in your work. And the other question is how the digital domain kind of has changed your practice. If immediacy of seeing images quickly, and if anything kind of strikes your fancy in that.
I think I'll take the uncanny because it's harder, and it's also. I mean, I'm not an expert on the uncanny. I really, but what it means to me is a kind of picture that you've. I mean, all different. I guess I kind of would invent my own definition of the word, but it's about a photograph I've seen before. So this is where the idea of having already seen it typically through media or reproductions or engravings or print matter. So there's this idea that, and this is something that the pictures generation, this group of artists, from Cindy Sherman to Richard Prince, to somehow me, working with a kind of reprocessed or rethinking or substituting kind of, you've already seen it, it already has been seen sort of idea. And so that's what I would think of as the uncanny, but how do you make a photograph that's uncanny? That was the difficulty in the light sources, was how to make something that was completely different from something else, but was also extremely familiar. So it was a sort of a problem that I set for myself, and a lot of times it would come accidentally. So the idea of the accidental, unintended, became ironically, the unintended becomes the thing that I've already seen. So it's like a paradox. But, it's like something you have to cultivate.
Hey, Jim.
Hi, Tony.
Hey. A couple years ago, I went to a show by a really well-known artist, and he had scanned some X-rays, printed them on really large canvases, and called them paintings. Now...
It's great that you don't know who that artist is.
Is Julian Schnabel.
Oh, okay.
So now I go to Photo LA, and I think because a lot of sellers don't want to say that they're inkjets, they're calling them pigment prints. So I'm thinking, okay, an artist, a painter, like having a fleet of interns and having someone else paint their paintings, is having an inkjet basically spray his painting onto a canvas. So now photographers are using pigment prints. So is now photography a painting?
This is the second question I didn't want to answer, the digital question, but repackaged, so I won't recognize it. Well, the great thing about digital stuff, all things digital, is that it's unlocking certain relationships that were bound together in photography. And one of the things that was bound together was the thing that I kind of hoped to unlock in the trichromatic pictures or the hexachromes, where I could separate out the channels and do different things with them, because it was a lot more difficult. It was not impossible, but you could do that with old-fashioned chemical photography. But the great thing about digital, the great thing and the difficult thing is that in digital technology and processes, you can break apart these color relationships that were previously bundled together. You could never really touch them unless you made a dye transfer photograph. But on the other hand, there are a lot of things that are impossible with digital technology. For instance, the photogram is going to be a thing of the past when we get rid of like optically projected photographs. So Schnabel's X-rays, I suppose X-rays will still be a photogram even when chemical photography disappears. But the promise of digital is it's going to wipe away certain things, but it will bring in a whole slew of other interesting developments. And one of them is these things called pigment prints. I call them inkjet prints, but some people call them pigment prints or glissé prints. All sorts of different names for them, but it's a more permanent kind of photograph, which is a really great thing. But it's still a work that you have to deal with, you have to think about, and in the end, there's no easy answer to what the question of making, a work of art is. Even though the means might have gotten easier, maybe that's going to make it harder. But a very good question. Actually, Tony is responsible for the incredible color in Glass House. He synthesized it and put it in his cap and made it come out really, really beautifully. So let's all. This would be a great opportunity for me to thank my team. It's called Team Welling. Valerie Green, Taryn Hosadian, John Sisley, J.R. Valenzuela have all helped me making my pictures, and they're like they do a lot of the Photoshop work that I'm not either able to or don't have time to do. But it's really great to be able to work with such a fantastic team. So. And I guess now it's time for the book signing. So thank you.